Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak with you here today and mark the 25th anniversary of the North Sea Piper Alpha disaster, a terrible, foreseeable and preventable tragedy that continues to deeply affect the lives of so many today. It's my great pleasure to speak after Jane. Jane's given you a very comprehensive overview of the regulatory regimes as applied in Australia and how we've embedded the Piper Alpha and Lord Cullen recommendations into the regulatory regime, at least at the Commonwealth level. I'm going to attempt to take a slightly different approach in giving you a bit of an overview of the Australian industry and how some of the issues that you've heard over the last 3 days play out. In his Gettysburg Address, a memorable and defining speech, Lincoln, ironically recognizing the inadequacy of speeches, said the following: "We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract." But he calls on the living to dedicate themselves to the higher purpose. Then it was democracy, and for us today, it is the protection of life. And the question for us all is, what is our responsibility for that? The seriousness of what we confront as humans responsible for other human lives cannot be underestimated. Our oil and gas and our energy story is both compelling and exciting, and we are rightly very proud of our industry. But we need to remember the humans in the landscape and why we work and why we demand energy. Before I came to this conference, I had an email from a young man who's operating in Perth. He's working actually in the mining industry. He had Googled the Piper Alpha conference and seen that Jane and I were attending, and he emailed me to say, first of all, that he was highly heartened by the work that had been done to improve safety over the last 25 years. His father was actually killed on Piper Alpha. And then he said, but I have to ask you, I have to raise a question with you as you're going to Piper Alpha. It still seems to me, working in the mining resource sector in Australia, that production and operations still take precedence over safety on many occasions. Some of the Australian leaders of our companies were actually young petroleum engineers and engineers in Aberdeen at the time of Piper Alpha. So not only do we have the Lord Cullen legacy in the regulations, but we also inevitably, because we're a global industry, have it in the people who operate in the Australian industry. So the safety legacy of Piper Alpha endures across the global oil and gas industry after 25 years. And as we have heard over the last few days, that legacy has fundamentally changed the approach to the safety regulation, but also the design and management of offshore oil and gas sector, not only here in the North Sea, but very much in Australia. Recent offshore incidents, such as the ones that Jane has highlighted for you, provide an all too stark reminder of the need for industry, not regulators, to show constant and transparent is the word I'll come back to, leadership and vigilance in applying the best available global technology standards, practices, and regulation. As Jane said, we are truly an independent industry. We have a global supply chain, and that supply chain is operating in Australia just the same as it is here in the North Sea and in the Gulf of Mexico. But not only that, not only are we a global industry who are independent, we're also a very diverse industry. We aren't just one homogeneous industry. We are made up of lots of different components. I'll come back to APIA, but APIA, we represent the onshore industry as well as the offshore. So the issues around that transparency and our public profile is something that I'm going to touch on a little bit more. We cover everything from offshore drilling exploration activity with its own culture and to many extent, to big refineries, gas plants that are operating in 3 or 4 different locations already in Australia. But also we have a massive growth in construction activity in Australia at the moment. So I will now focus and go into a little bit more depth about who the Australian industry is. The fundamental principles of safety leadership and management are well-tested, well-known, and enduring. And yet, the challenges remain as great today as they were 25 years ago. And the question is, how do we provide and sustain strong and authentic leadership, and how do we transform every person in the industry into a safety leader, responsible within and across teams, and with a clear line of sight to the hazards and risks across our operations, and most importantly, with a really clear understanding of the potentiality of incidents. Given our global supply chain, the industry has and does share and learn from major events, but the challenge is to ensure we are not just looking at what we understand and can see, and that we do not just cherry pick from the learnings, as Jane has already illustrated, and this is true for governments as well as industry. In Australia, and I'll come back a little bit more to the Australian political scene, in Australia we have had a general duties style of safety regime in place since the 70s. The associated concepts of, for example, of defined duty holders, reduction of risk to as low as reasonably practical, and workforce participation have a well-established history. Since Piper, as an industry in Australia, and I suspect across the globe, we have focused on the first of what I call the cumulative curves of safety. We've been focused very heavily on the design, engineering, hardware, systems, and procedures of the curves that you see. Much has been done to improve safety performance over the last decades, and enormous resources have and do go into technological developments, engineering, and extensive risk assessments, as well as systems and procedures. However, the last curve, which is about people and teams, is the bit that I'm going to come to, and I think has been a common theme of a lot of the sessions through this conference today, although I think it's even more complex than just people and teams. I'm going to now touch a little bit on the industry's interaction with NOPSEMA as the regulator that is in effect giving effect to the Cullen recommendations on regulation. Given the often mobile and highly dynamic nature of much of the offshore oil and gas activity, we do need to develop safety cases in addition to our ongoing systems, management systems and procedures that we have that are often global, and they operate right through our operations, whether we're operating in Houston or in Perth off the Western Australian coast. We then need to take those and tailor them into how we are managing specific facilities, activities, and contractor interface, and how we are actually doing what we say we're going to do at the time, and with the particular environment and risks that we have in front of us. And that is why the industry, similar to what Malcolm says, truly does support and embrace the role of NOPSEMA and other regulators as strong, independent challengers of what we put to them as a case for how we're managing the risks of our activities. And while I think the industry has come a long way and we have implemented a lot of the findings of the Cullen inquiry, I would support Jane, and I think many of our industry would, that we've still got some way to go to ensure that what we're doing in our safety cases is not just templating, and that we don't get complacent, that we actually do demonstrate in a joined-up dots way the logic of our decision-making processes and the robustness of our decision-making processes, and that those link directly to the major accident risks, and that we have a clear line of sight to them. And everything that we have in place measures, we have performance measures and standards that actually demonstrate a direct line of sight to those high-risk events. So to that extent, we are extremely supportive of a regulation. I should add that in addition to the safety case regime, we also have a full cost recovery regime operating in Australia. So the oil and gas industry actually fully pays for our independent regulator. So while all of this has achieved admirable results over the last 2 decades, the fact remains that there has been an unacceptable level of incidents with what can only be called high potential both for personal safety but also for major accidents, we should be feeling more than unease. And the public face of safety too often looks and sounds like the nanny state, is trivial and controlling, and leads to derision and resistance, and is all too often inauthentic. In more recent times, behavioural programs have been bolted onto the safety management systems, focused almost exclusively on personal safety and attempting to influence behaviour. Now, I actually am not in any way knocking behavioural programs. I think they have a real place. And I use the analogy of how society has changed in relation to smoking. And in many cases, the early legislation which banned smoking from workplaces and from public places was resisted extensively and really did focus initially on behavioural change rather than necessarily changing the hearts and minds of people. But if you look at where we are today, I think you would agree that that's a very strong example of where behavioural change can really lead to change. And I also, when I was looking at one of your local papers yesterday, came across an article talking about mobile devices, and I think in relation to just making sure that the understanding is not that we're not focused on personal safety and behavioural safety when we talk about major accident events. We're not in any way wanting to take the focus off those. Here's a quick extract. When children get their own phones, the consequences can be catastrophic. Catherine Littlewood, 15, was hit by a train and killed on a level crossing last year. Her iPod, headphones and the BlackBerry on which she had been texting friends were found next to her body. And now comes analysis by RoadSafe and AXA Insurance that shows that 11-year-old pedestrians are 3 times more likely to be seriously injured on the way to and from school than 10-year-olds. And since 11 is the average age at which children receive their first mobile phone, 6 times more likely to be sending a text when it happens. There is, the report concludes, a clear correlation between the use of technology and the time of serious accidents with children. We, or mobile technology, need to evolve. And I really think the pertinent issue there is I'm using it really just in support of behavioural, but the real pertinent issue is around the ability as we as humans to be distracted. And that really is at the heart of some of the human factors. Okay. Leading speakers over this conference have established very clearly that we need a far more sophisticated and in-depth understanding of the interaction and the functioning of organisations and humans to and in the work environment. We need to forensically investigate the whole spectrum of factors involved, and we need to heed in full the piercing clarity of independent experts such as Lord Cullen and the Honourable Mr Justice Haddon Cave QC and Professor Hopkins. They are able to, free of legal barriers, put a piercing light through some of what we, in our passion for what we do, sometimes miss. So now I want to turn to a very slightly different tack. I want to go and look at Australia, and I'm going to start with an opening rhetorical question. So, is Australia the same, or are we different? And if I show you some of the differences, are they really that different? So I'm going to touch first of all on Australia's geography and population. Clearly, the very nature of the way of where we operate in Australia means that we're highly geographically dispersed around a massive a fringe continent where everybody in Australia lives in effect on the edge. We have a small population relative, therefore a very narrow pool of people to draw on. Apparently, some child told me last week from their school that if you took the circumference of Australia and you could actually take it around the world, that the circumference of Australia is equivalent of a journey around the world. So that gives you some idea of the logistics and the challenges that we face as an offshore regime in Australia. We are operating in extremely isolated environments. So when you look at an incident like Macondo and you look at things like our ability to get rigs to do relief well drilling, to do anything like containment. We don't have the density of vessels. We're not anywhere near each other. We've got huge geographic areas to cover. We've got huge challenges with even things like getting people on and off our facilities and where we can get them to some of the major ports, even doing things like aeromedical evacuation, search and rescue. In some parts of Australia, it is really a unique challenge. Now I'm going to quickly touch on the law and politics. We have in Australia what they call a Westminster system. So while most of the principles that are embedded in our law and politics are fundamentally based on the UK legal system and political system, we are nevertheless a federation. And we're made up of states and the Commonwealth. And as in any healthy democracy, that state federal system is actually part of the checks and balances of power of a democratic system. So it's fundamental to the way we maintain our democratic system in Australia. But by its nature, of course, it leads to tensions when you're operating a national and global industry as we are, and you've got multiple regulators with multiple, and our activities move, as Jane accurately pointed out, we can move across 3 different regimes for one thing where the same hydrocarbon is passing through 3 different facilities. That inevitably needs very, very careful work to make sure that there are no gaps, that where you have duplication and overlap, that you've managed the responsibilities and who's got responsibility. Also, and this is just my throwing a little bit back at the government, as much as we utterly support the independence, it can sometimes result in turf wars, which quite frankly from industry's point of view is completely unhelpful. However, I think the fundamental basis of the state federal system is a good one, and it is all about that checks and balances. Also, I would say about the Australian system, and probably a little bit similar to the British system, it's a competitive adversarial legal system. And even more so than in Britain, the Australian institutions built in the adversarial nature. It's actually embedded into our institutions. So the history of industrial relations in Australia is really about institutionalized arbitration and a very centralized form of strikes and union and employer interaction. So that's part of the history and the culture that make up the workforce and the way that we operate in Australia. You can't really talk about Australia and not think about the history and the culture. Of course, a large part of Australia was settled by convicts. It is a long history. This, I'm just going to touch on, no, I've missed it. This unique sense of culture and humour is recognised, and the Australian government actually has some material up on the Australian government website to try to explain to the rest of the world just how the Australian humour and culture works. And I'm going to quote you something from their site. The unique sense of Australian humour is recognised the world over as being distinctly Australian. Our humour is dry, full of extremes, anti-authoritarian, anti-egalitarian, self-mocking and ironic. We are famous for the tall poppy syndrome, i.e. knock everybody down to size. The country, and this is a quote from one of our comedians on the Australian website, the country itself is the ultimate joke. The wave you body surf into shore after a day at the beach, because we all spend our days at the beach, could contain a shark or a riptide, and when you get back, your house could have burnt to the ground in a bushfire. This is where the whole no worries things comes from. Finally, I'd like to touch on another thing which I think is actually similar to the British Anglo-Saxon regime. We have a very individualistic, competitive culture. And that is embedded in our organisations and in our culture, in our whole way of being. And yet we're moving, I suppose, to a more collaborative and collective need to do things. And the two can be at real tension with each other. I'm going to touch very quickly on some Australian thinking patterns. If you put a different inflection on them, you just might recognise some of them. Perhaps we are not all so different. So the first one is mateship. All of these characteristics can be taken as negative, and I'm only actually going to touch on them because they actually reveal something about how we deal with culture and how we deal with leadership, and when we're looking at our institutions and our organizational structures and how we deal with the people in our workplaces, we can work against, we can look to change, or we can work with and change. So I touch on mateship first of all. The value of mateship is one of the most strongly held within the Australian consciousness and forms the basis of much Australian folklore. Importantly, the value of mateship is not so much actually about friendship, bonding and loyalty, as it is about joining in defiance against a common figure. Australia could be perceived as having a relatively immature and childlike culture, characteristics driven by this domination of defiance in thinking. Workplace safety, with its rules, compliance, audits, observations, and behavioural-based safety tools, can elicit this defiance thinking pattern. It's important for leaders to examine their leadership style and consider whether they are authoritarian and lead in ways in which they push their employees to conform, or lead in ways that create division between management and workers. The next one, give a fair go. This is strongly associated with the value of mateship and relates to Australian egalitarianism or the classless society. While it manifests in terms of equal opportunities for all, it is firmly entrenched in the rejection of hierarchical systems and the idea that everyone is or should be equal. She'll be right. She'll be right is an attitude firmly entrenched within the Australian psyche and one of the most readily recognisable phrases in our vernacular. Importantly, this thinking pattern is not necessarily about being laissez-faire. Rather, it's about controlling one's response to a challenge and finding a way akin to a belief or sureness that we will work it out. It relies on ingenuity and problem solving, and it touches on the stoicness and the independence, which I also think are characteristics of the British system. Have a go. Have a go is also about Australian ingenuity. It's about a willingness to try various solutions. It could be interpreted as just get on with it, whereas in fact it's actually an attitude which drives careful consideration and the implementation of ideas. I guess it also touches on the fact, which I also around our industry and the multifaceted nature of our industry. And I was talking to some of our exploration people in Australia recently in relation to the industry's moving to a case for environment similar to a safety case under the NOPSEMA regime, and at least the short-term pain that we have gone through in changing our environmental mental landscape to actually fit with the alert concepts and the case regime. And they were going, but Miranda, it's just that we're passionate, we want to do it. We're a doing, problem-solving people, we just want to get on with it, and we're just completely frustrated. And I think that's some of the tensions that we work through, is that's what makes us great. That is why as an industry, we are what we are, because it was based on that frontier mentality of can-do, problem-solving, innovative, risk-taking. The problem is that we're now in a world where that is not acceptable any longer, and getting that balance between that innovative, creative problem solving and the need for us to actually operate in a transparent and robust and stringent way, as we've described earlier, is a tension. So finally, fair dinkum and Anya. So fair dinkum is really about honesty and authenticity. And I think that goes to the heart of what passes as so much of the discussion around personal safety. It's not that personal safety isn't important, because if you hurt your back or you actually have a single fatality, that is just as much something for us to focus on as a major accident event, and it can impact on people's lives. A series of these events has a massive impact on people's lives. The problem is that too much of what we've done in personal safety has come across as utterly inauthentic and trivial. So we're busy telling other people, observing other people about putting lids on coffee cups while we're busy getting on with doing something far more dangerous ourselves. That whole nature of fair dinkum and authenticity is critical. Anya relates to the Australian way of giving and accepting praise, and when we're working across different cultural areas, the whole issue of whether you elevate people, and in some societies praise and putting people up on a pedestal is the way to go. In Australia, that's not, and you get the tall poppy syndrome happening, and people don't like being pushed above other people. So that's just a quick overview of the Australian culture, and I guess the real issue about it is any of that really that different to the rest of the industry? And therefore, what does that actually mean for the way we go about looking at both process safety and personal safety? What does it mean for our leadership styles? And what does it mean for the way we look at our organizational structures? What does it mean in terms of the way we look at our culture? We can't for any one moment take our eyes off what we're doing in the design, the engineering, the systems, all the things that made up those earlier curves of safety. We can't take our eyes off the major accident potentiality. We have to at any time have the courage and a culture that enables people to raise issues, and we don't get groupthink happening, that we're able to raise issues. And we need to sustain those curves, so we need a relentless focus on those curves. But then in addition to that, as has been so well illustrated by the outstanding presentations yesterday, that we need to integrate into those the organizational structures and the human interfaces with a firm understanding of how we actually personally lead. I'm going to just touch very quickly now on the Australian gas story. Australia basically is an LNG regime. We do have some oil, but our oil reserves are, I think we're estimating 7 years. We have significant natural gas resources, and gas is Australia's third largest energy resource after coal and uranium. It plays an important and growing role in our energy security. We currently have 3 LNG projects, the North West Shelf, the Darwin LNG, and the Pluto LNG. And as you saw from that map, you get a sense of how dispersed they are around Australia. There are 7 further projects now under construction or committed that cumulatively could involve capital expenditures of around $200 billion. Numerous other prospective projects are also being considered. Together, those under construction amount to capital expenditure of around $200 billion and many thousands of new jobs. But of course, this has implications for training, supervision, experience, and safety. And I'll just touch on our safety data, looking at the issues around the growth of our industry and the fact that we have a massive construction sector as well as a sophisticated upstream existing thing. It's huge impact for APIA on trying to, and on the industry, in trying to manage such a diverse range of different cultures, from onshore construction to offshore construction. And we've put in place a number of initiatives. I'm going to conclude just by showing how much we're on the same journey as the oil and gas industry globally, and how our initiatives are entirely aligned with what the step change in the UK oil and gas and others are doing, and how much we want to build on the legacy of Piper and this conference to continue to work globally, because the only way that we're going to make any difference is to tap into that interdependence that we have. One of the things I would also just say is, out of the Montara incident that we had in Australia, one of the really mind thoughts for the Australian government was, if that incident had occurred to the company that had owned Montara prior to PTTP owning it, what would the capacity of that company have been to pay for what ended up being the cleanup expenditure? So one of the things as an industry body, and I'm sure this is true for Oil and Gas UK, is that we don't have any mandatory way, and yet all of our companies, all of our members influence each other. Basically, we are all completely dependent on each other and each of our performances for maintaining the confidence of the governments and the public in Australia and globally to operate. And how do we influence and leverage off that as an industry body? We can't force it. We have a strict set of principles of membership of APIA, and I guess with the government we've been working on looking at the issues of the capacity of members of the industry to be in a position to be operating in where we could potentially have significant impacts on the environment. So that is one issue that we've been working through with the government. So we've got a number of projects in place to attempt to address the growth of our industry. We have a CEO Safety Leadership Forum, which is a little bit like the Step Change program, but it's probably a step before the Step Change program, and I think we're ready to partner and look for potentials to partner. The CEO Safety Leadership, nevertheless, has made some big inroads and has worked very hard to do some collective projects right across the industry. We have something that's a little bit similar to the joined-up thinking that you will have seen Step Change have in place. We have a thing that's called the Stand Together for Safety, which we run on an annual basis, and it's a time when the whole of the oil and gas industry right across Australia, onshore and offshore, on every facility, stops work in a rolling series of events through May, and we have different themes. So last year the theme was keeping it contained, what's your responsibility? And similar to the Joined Up, we had a DVD that showed a variety of people across the industry talking about what their responsibility was, everybody from the CEO of one of the major operators down to engineers, design engineers, to everybody offshore. So a complete traverse of what everybody's responsibility is and all the different barriers and how they all connect. This year, to try and build on that theme of keeping it contained, we moved to a team theme with a view that whether you're the engineering design team sitting in an office on shore or wherever you are, you're part of a team. It might be an immediate team around you, or actually it might be a virtual team. And to get everybody thinking about how what they do impacts on the different areas that their team goes way beyond just where they're sitting. In addition, we have 2 training programs which we've rolled out very specifically to target the growth of the industry, and they're quite radically new programs in that they're very human factors based, and they're very immersive and simulated. So we actually put new workers, experienced workers, and we put supervisors through a very intensive, simulated, immersive type training that focus on human factors and the sort of behaviours that we're looking for to start their careers out in the oil and gas industry. We've got a whole range of other programs which I won't go into detail, but really what it highlights is that we're all in it together, and the things that we're doing are all the same. The challenges that we have, whether it's from well operations, environment, or whether it is process safety, prevention of major accidents, we're working on the same things, and coming together globally in an event like this is absolutely critical to our success. Thank you very much for having me.